Hi everyone, and welcome to another video. Thank you to all of you who have supported the channel so far, and if you've just stumbled across this video, a big welcome to you. This diorama is titled The Elevator, and is inspired by antique wood-panelled elevators with the mandatory eerie twist. So come take a look and see how it was made, and don't forget to hang around until the end to see the final shots. Okay, let's go. This project started with making a template for the panelled walls of the elevator. I just used Microsoft Word and a bunch of rectangles to create this simple design. This design is kind of an amalgamation of styles I found through researching antique elevators online. By the way, my scale for this project is roughly 1/16. Now I knew that this diorama would entail a lot of cutting and shaping of small pieces of wood, so before diving straight into the model, I decided to first make a mock-up of the interior walls of the elevator just to make sure the scale and overall look of the design worked visually. I just grabbed some cardboard and stuck on the cutouts. Then attach them with sticky tape. And here's the finished template. I think the overall design looks good, and at this scale, I'm fairly confident it'll work with the materials I have. What I'm about to show you is the first of two techniques I experimented with when making the elevator walls. So the initial construction of the elevator began with cutting out another copy of the original template and lightly gluing these to thin balsa sheets. These will be the backing boards for the overlaying panels. The first technique I used was to cut around the printed template. In hindsight, this was the more difficult of the two techniques, but I started with this because I thought it would give me a more accurate cutout. So here's the finished cutout, and finished off by sanding the inside edges. And once that's done, I attached the cutout to the back panel. I made both side walls of the elevator using this method. Next, I started on the center panel. I knew this had to be the more exact panel because this is the one that will be the most visible. This is where I experimented with another way of making the panels. Similar to the first method, I used a thin sheet of plywood, but this time I cut out the strips for the panels using the paper template for measurements. Here I'm gluing the paper template to the plywood and marking out where the strips will go. When that was done, I removed the template and marked in the boundary lines. Next, I glued on the strips using PVA, starting with the top and the bottom strips. Then the vertical strips, and the side strips. Finally, I placed in the horizontal strips, and this is the finished panel. I wanted to close up the cut lines between the strips, and I filled these in with some diluted plaster filler. And then sanded the filler flat. Okay, this is the part of the project that I really loved, and that was making the framing. I could have bought some pre-made moulding, and next time I probably will, but I decided to try a technique I saw online. Now this is a barbecue scraper that I found cheap at the supermarket. It's not the scraper that's important, but the strength of the metal that I was looking for. I'd say this is about 1mm stainless steel. Basically what I've done is to file the shape of the moulding into the steel. And I guess what's cool about this technique is that you can create pretty much any shaped moulding you want. For the moulding itself, I used pop sticks. I found that the pop sticks were the perfect thickness for the moulding because I needed them to be slightly raised above the panel strips. One downside of the pop sticks is that in their original state, they were too soft and splintered too easily, and when shaped, also became furry. So I made a wash of PVA glue, diluted in water, and then soaked them overnight. After soaking, I left them until they were totally dry. After deciding on the thickness of the moulding, I marked out the cut lines to make the strips. Alright, now for the magic part. Using the scraper I made earlier, I drag it down the wood to carve out the shape of the moulding. This does take a lot of passes to make a finished strip, and in hindsight, I should have experimented with different woods of a longer length, as I found this process quite time consuming, but I am pleased with the results. After each strip is finished, I sand down the edges. Then it's just repeat until I had a good stash of moulded strips. The final stage in this step is adding the moulding to the inside of the frames. I bought this angle cutter, which really helped with fitting the moulding accurately. Then I just repeated this process until all the frames were in. I'm not gluing at this stage because I want to make sure all the frames fit well. Due to the minute differences in the length of the panel strips, each frame needs to be custom cut. Okay, now I'm happy with the fit. I glue each frame into place with PVA. Just like I did with the previous step, I'm filling in the joins with diluted filler. And when the filler was dry, I gave everything a light sand. From the beginning, I had a maple coloured stain in mind. From the reference photos I researched, I was drawn to the glow of the maple coloured wood. I brushed the stain onto the panel and let it dry before applying 2 more coats. And through the magic of editing, here are all 5 panels finished. Now to start on the construction of the elevator. This is standard foam board, to which I'm gluing on the wood panels. Here I'm adding the ceiling frame to the top of the centre panel. This also hides any inconsistency in the cuts of each panel, and I'll add the other side soon. I thought that some mirrored panels would be a cool effect, so I found some acrylic mirror sheets which I cut to size. I found that I didn't need to glue the mirrors in as they press tightly into the frames. And here are the finished walls of the elevator. The next step is to join them all up. I join them by bracing the external walls with pieces of balsa. Now I can add the side ceiling strips using the centre strip as a guide. This detail wasn't in my initial design, but I found that the corner joints were a bit too visible, so I'm adding a thin strip to each corner. Now it's time to get started on the elevator floor. In my original concept, I had planned to just use strips of plywood for the floor, but between then and now, I chanced upon these laminate tile samples in the hardware store. I really liked the finished look of these tiles and the fact that I wouldn't need to cut, fit, and stain handmade wood boards. However, in their original state, they look a little bit unrealistic as a single piece of floor, so I marked out some floorboard lines which I'll cut later. But first, the tile is also looking a little bit too new looking. So I'm going to rough it up a bit with some sandpaper. Now that the shine is a bit toned down, I'm going to cut the floorboard lines into the tile. And I think that looks a lot more realistic. From my reference photos, I really liked the elevators that had patterns on the floor. I made this pattern in Word and printed the template out. I used the template to mark out the lines, which I've masked out. I'll be painting the pattern in using this gold leaf pen. And here I'm marking out each line one at a time. Here's the finished pattern. I was quite impressed with the reflectivity of that gold pen. But seeing this as a well-used elevator, I need to distress those nice shiny lines a bit with sandpaper. Next, I'm thinking about the button panel. Again, in a lot of my reference photos, there was a lot of brass being used in old elevators, so I'm kind of going for that look. This is a thin piece of brass sheet that I'm cutting to the size of the button panel. I've marked out the lines where the buttons will go. Now, as I was looking around for something to make the buttons out of, I came across a piece of Lego that looked the right size. So I cut off the round top of the Lego piece, and there you go, a perfect antique elevator button. Okay, spoiler alert. Unfortunately, this part of the diorama failed. The optic fibre strand snapped as I was gluing it into its final place. However, I've kept this footage in the video as the idea did actually work, and I'll definitely use optic fibre lighting in the future. So what I had in mind was to have one of the buttons lit. I didn't really need to have a separate LED light for this, so I made a hole in the centre of one of the buttons where I would attach a strand of optic fibre. The optic fibre would then be connected to the final light. Here I'm gluing the buttons into their final positions. Now this is the button that was supposed to be lit with the optic fibre, so I'm marking the place where I need to drill a hole. Okay, on to something different. I'm now thinking about the foyer that will be in the foreground of the elevator. I was thinking that a reflective tile floor would look good, and hopefully reflect some light in the final piece. This is just a plain white tile I purchased from the hardware store and cut to size. Like the elevator floor tile, this also looks unrealistic on its own, so here I'm marking out some grout lines, which I gouged out using a needle tool. It took several passes to make the lines deep enough. And here's the finished tile floor. I've brushed it with a black wash to make the grout lines more visible. Back to the optic fibre button. I bought this cheap optic fibre lamp and pulled out a strand. As you can see, I've got lots more for future projects. I then glued the optic strand into the hole in the button. Before adding the last button, I thought the panel looked a little bit too new and too shiny, so I made a mixture of water and vinegar and brushed this over the brass plate. After applying a good layer, I left it to dry for about an hour. I had never tried this technique before, but I was really pleased with the results. Definitely a technique to use again if I need to age brass quickly. Here I've printed some tenant name plaques that I'll add to the button panel. I then attach them with a tiny spot of super glue. And to match the aged look of the panel, I'm staining the nameplates with coffee. Now to attach the final button with the optic fibre. Looking back at these shots, I'm still really bummed that this part didn't work. Okay, onto the ceiling of the elevator. Even though this wouldn't be very visible, I still wanted the ceiling to have some depth and interest. Here I've cut out 3 pieces of plywood, and each piece will overlap, creating a beveled ceiling. The hole in the centre is where the light will go. Then, using the same stain as the elevator walls, the ceiling is done. Now the final detail in the elevator is the handrail. I love reflections and using materials that give off pings of light at certain angles. Here I'm using some solid brass tubing for the handrails. I hadn't planned this out beforehand, so I needed a way to attach the handrails to the wall. Because I had the Lego out for the previous step, I found these attachment parts that I've cut down to hold the handrail. And just by chance, they were exactly the right size for the brass tubing. I used the same gold leaf pen used for the elevator floor to colour them in, and they ended up being a really good match for the brass handrails. After the ink was dry, it was a simple matter of clicking them onto the handrails. Super glue was used to attach the handrails to the elevator walls. And this is the result. So now the interior of the elevator is pretty much finished. Now I'm attaching the button panel to the left-hand wall. And here's the result. Next, the elevator needs a base for all the components to sit evenly on. For this I'm using a piece of foam board. Then the elevator walls are secured to the floor with super glue. Now there wasn't a lot of real estate for the glue to hold, so I'm reinforcing the walls with some scrap blocks of wood. Finally, the front wall panels can go on. And here's some shots of the finished elevator. I'm really enjoying the maple stained panels and aged brass combination. Definitely one to use again. Leading up to this stage, I started looking closely at real elevator doors and how they opened and closed on tracks. I found these scrap pieces of metal that were already nicely worn and weathered. To create the look of the door tracks, I glued 3 of these pieces together like this. The interior doors also needed tracks, and I thought that brass would be the best look. This is thin brass sheeting that I've scored with a knife, one for the floor and one for the top of the door. Here I'm using half square tubing for the inside elevator doors. And now attaching the top of the doorway. Here you can see I've glued the door tracks I made before to the side of the tile floor. This will be attached later. Next, I made the outside door and lobby wall from foam board. Okay, I needed the whole diorama to sit on the same platform. I wanted something thin but rigid, so I cut out a square of 3mm MDF. For the walls, I'm going for a simple plaster effect. I base coated the foam board with gesso primer, which seals the paper covering the foam board, and it will give the overlaying plaster something to stick to. Before the plaster goes on, I'm covering the walls with a coat of hemp coloured acrylic. This is to give some contrast when I plan to chip some of the plaster away. I always think you can't create a more realistic plaster effect than by using real plaster. For most of my projects with plaster walls, I like to use hydrocal plaster mixed with PVA glue. The PVA makes a stronger plaster and will also bond stronger to the wall. The plaster is mixed as per the instructions on the box, but the amount of PVA is just a guess. More PVA creates a stronger plaster, less PVA is more brittle, so you can adjust the amount to suit the effect. After the plaster is mixed, I dabbed on a thin coat. When the whole area was covered, I tilted the panel from side to side to level out the mixture. And when it dried, here's the result. Continuing with the rundown theme, I'm chipping away areas of plaster, mainly around the edges to give the impression that some wood panelling has been pulled off. I didn't want to go too far with the chipping, so here's where I stopped. The plaster in its original state is very absorbent, so before applying the final coat of paint, I'm priming each panel with matte varnish, which I've got to do off camera. The colour I've chosen for the final coat is a cream coloured acrylic, and this was applied to the 3 lobby walls. Now it's time to add the external elevator doors. I'm using some scrap pieces of aluminium which have the right thickness to look realistic enough. These are attached to the back of the door panel with superglue. And here's that step finished. Here I'm priming the ceiling mouldings with white acrylic before overcoating them with deck tan. I've purposefully gone with subdued colours for the lobby, A, to keep it in theme, and B, to have a subdued counterfoil for the warm toned elevator. Here I'm cutting out the wainscoting for the lobby walls. This was made from the same plywood sheeting used for the elevator, and then attached to the walls below the plaster layer. And here are the lobby wall panels finished. Okay, here I'm starting to focus on the details, and starting with weathering the plaster walls. My go-to for weathering plaster is chalk pastels, and for this part I'm using a mixture of brown and ochre. Now it's time to attach the elevator call button that I made earlier using the same materials as the interior panel. And the front wall goes up, followed by the left side, then the right. And the ceiling of the elevator goes on too. Off camera, I made the lobby ceiling using the same plaster technique as the lobby walls. This plaster I didn't paint and just left as plain white plaster. Finally, here's the finished structure of the entire diorama. I've bolstered the wall panels for a bit of extra stability and used masking tape to tape over the edges to stop any light bleeding through. For the light fixture, I've taken a piece of packing strip and cut it to the size of the hole. I've always thought this packing strip plastic looks exactly like the fluorescent light coverings I see in older style buildings. I also cut out a couple of pieces to make it look like it's been broken. A final touch was to add a square of yellow cellophane over the light fitting. This is to give the final light more of an antique glow. Speaking of lights, I'm using an IKEA USB book lamp, the same type used in the autumn tree diorama. I like these because they are cheap and give off a fairly strong light. What I need to do first is to remove the lamp housing to expose the LED. And here's the final rig. I reincarnated my bonsai skills to hold the lamp stem into place. And down the bottom, I'll be attaching a USB extension cable soon. I found that the LED was moving around too much, and I needed it to shine at a precise angle, so I glued it to a piece of wood. I've also added a bit more tape to ensure no light leaks. Okay, it wouldn't be inside the box dioramas without a box, right? The box is made out of 1.8cm pine board, thanks to my brother for doing the cutting. It's then glued and nailed together. Now this part wasn't planned, but I'm so glad it came about because I really like the finished look. I had originally planned to stain the pine box, but I kind of botched the painting stage, so I stained these thin plywood sheets and attached them to the outside of the box. It's also the same maple stain used for the elevator interior. You can see in this shot, I've carved out a hole at the back of the box to insert the USB extension cable. I've also embedded these magnets into the inside of the frame. I like using magnets because it means I don't have to permanently seal the diorama. The box will be framed with this recycled frame. By coincidence, the frame is exactly the same colour as the maple stains used in the box. The frame was chopped up and glued back together to fit the size of the box. Oh, and on the inside of the frame, I've glued in some pins that will grab the magnets. And to complete the frame, I cut a piece of glass to size and added some mounting board to the inside of the frame. I made some small details to add interest to the lobby and also to add to the story of the diorama. Here's a pile of dust that's been swept into the corner. It's made from crushed, leftover plaster that's been bonded with terrain glue. I've been looking for a reason to use these miniature newspapers I made, and I think they'll make an interesting addition to the scene. The paper is a bit too light for the look I'm going for, so I'm using some coffee to add a bit of age. Perfect. Not too much, but you can see the difference with the original printout. Now to position it so that it looks like it's been blown into the corner. And another newspaper for the inside of the elevator. I'm trying to make the position look as natural as possible. And the final prop, which adds some detail to the narrative. I made the notice of closure letter in Word. Okay, I better stop before I get too carried away with the details. Let's close the frame and take a look at how the diorama looks in natural light. And now the moment I've been waiting for, and hopefully you too. Let's switch on the light and see how the diorama looks in the dark. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to my channel for more videos. Okay, I'm off to make another diorama. See you again soon.